I've got to tell you something. My wife and daughter have been using this cheap and flimsy Ikea desk for at least 2 years. It was super awkward to plug the laptop in underneath the desk. And since there was zero storage, that means the desktop was just always a mess. I couldn't take it anymore. So I set out to design and build them a better one. I made this sleek flip-up panel for easy access to a hidden power strip, and I added a handful of drawers to help them get everything organized. And do you want to know what the best part is? It's way easier to build than you probably think. Let's go make some sawdust.
To kick things off, I start by breaking down the plywood and cutting it all down to its final dimensions. Once all the pieces for the base of this desk are cut to final size, I move on to adding pocket holes so that way I can knock out the assembly. Now I'm using the Craig Foreman, but they also have several other options that are smaller and less expensive. I need to make the front edges of this plywood as smooth as possible, and there are a couple of options to do this. One, I could use putty, but that usually takes a bit longer and the results aren't always great. So I'm opting to use some edge banding that I can just iron on and then trim up later.
So once all of my pieces are edge banded, I then need to trim that up. And the fastest way to do that is at the router table. And it's set up so that the router bit will trim off just the excess of the edge banding and not actually cut into the side of my board. I'm just about ready to start assembling these base cabinets, but the last thing that I need to do is sand the edges where the edge banding is. Even though I just trimmed it flush on the router table, since the plywood is sometimes bowed one way or the other, sometimes it gets all of the edge banding off and sometimes there's just a little bit left behind. I'm going to quickly use my 3x4 sander and then start screwing these cabinets together. Now that I have the box screwed together, I'm gonna add some dividers. And to make that easier, I've cut a couple of spacers, so that way I don't have to measure. I can just set the dividers on top of the spacers and screw them in place.
The pieces that I'm screwing together right now are going to sit on top of the left and right cabinets on the base of this desk, and it's going to give me a shadow line to separate the desktop from the base of the desk. Since I don't have any edge banding that's more than 1.5 inches wide, here I'm puttying the edges of this plywood so that way I have a smooth surface for the paint to lay down on. Now that the cabinet boxes are built for the base of this desk, I'm going to move on to making the drawer boxes. I need to cut a groove in all of the pieces that will make up the sides, front, and back of my drawer boxes, and there are a couple of ways to do this, but this time I opted to use a table saw and make 2 consecutive passes so that way the groove was the proper width for the thickness of my drawer bottoms. I'm using undermount drawer glides for this desk because they're really nice, and they require a little notch to be cut in the back of the drawer box, so my go-to method to cut this notch is on the bandsaw. The drawer bottoms are the last piece that I need to cut out, and then I can move on to some joinery. Off camera, I went ahead and edge banded all of the pieces for the drawer box, and now I'm back over at the Craig Foreman drilling micro pocket holes since this is 1/2 inch material. Once the drawer boxes are assembled, I move on to prepping them for the undermount drawer slides. I don't know about y'all, but a good old cup of coffee sure helps me change gears and keep on going.
I've just rough cut a bunch of boards and I pulled out more than I need. Some of these are pretty bowed. I mean, like this one right here, it looks like a dog leg. But right now I'm looking at 32 inches. The only reason I pulled out this many boards is because, like I said, some of these are really crooked. So my final depth for the desk is going to be 24 inches. So if you can do some quick basic math, 32, 24, 8 inches. Unless I lose more than 8 inches of width on this, I'm not going to need these extra boards. So next up is the joiner. Let's go flatten some lumber. With all the boards planed almost to their final thickness, I'm going to start prepping the edges so that way I can glue up the panel. But if you notice, some of these are really crooked, and it's going to be way too much work to straighten these out on the joiner. So I have a couple of options. One, I could use a track saw. Two, I could use a jigsaw. Or three, my option is I'm going to use the band saw. So I'm going to set up on that, cut these lines as straight as I can, and then I'll go over to the joiner and table saw to make sure that all of my edges are nice and straight prior to the glue up. All right, all of the table sawing, all the joining is done, so now it's time for a little bit of an artistic look at laying out the grain pattern of this ambrosia maple. I don't want to have it too heavy with features on one end and totally bland on the other. What I'm going to do is glue it into two sections and then glue those two sections together. So once I have the pattern figured out, I'm going to mark it so that way I can just focus on getting the boards in place and gluing them up quickly without having to stress about maintaining the pattern.
While I slap these boards together, I want to take a quick minute and say thank you so much to Craig for sponsoring this project. It's because of them that the plans for this project are free. So if you grab the plans and build this desk, make sure to tag me when you post it on social media. I want to see how it turned out. Once the glue is cured, I run these pieces through the planer and bring them down to final thickness. And then I head over to the drum sander and give them an initial sanding just to remove any tear out and whatnot that may have been left behind from the planer. Now I'm going to set up on the table saw to cut a long miter so that way the grain continues over the front of this desk. Now you see this yellow mag switch feather board I used on the joiner earlier. I use this on the table saw a lot too, and it really helps to keep even pressure against the fence so that way my cuts come out nice and accurate. This ambrosia maple has a ton of wormholes and also a couple of big knot holes in it that need to be filled. So for the wormholes, I'm going to use CA glue, and for the knot holes, I'm going to use some Total Boat High Performance Epoxy along with my pigment of choice. In this case, it's Black Diamond Battleship Gray. Now, I do have links for a handful of these items in the description below and some discount codes so you can save a couple bucks on your next order. To make this desk look like it's a solid chunk of wood and a lot heftier than it actually is, I want to glue up some extra material here on the sides. So first I need to rough cut that on the radial arm saw and then glue on the filler pieces.
Okay, so I just screwed something up. I was cutting the desktop to final width and I read the wrong dimension on my plans. Thankfully, I didn't chuck the offcuts yet, but what I need to do now is do an end grain joint. I'll have to support it somehow, and hopefully it doesn't look bad. We'll see. So luckily this piece came off pretty easy. It had only been clamped up for about 30 minutes. I'll just run this through the drum sander, clean up this surface. Assuming that my repair goes well, I'll glue it in place on the, where it should have been. Yeah, let's do that.
While the glue cures on my hopeful attempt to save this desktop, I head over to the CNC and cut some templates that are going to help me make the flip-up panel for access to that hidden power strip I mentioned earlier. Now, just in case you don't have a CNC, I included some one-to-one printouts in the plans that are linked below, so that way you can print out the pages, stick it down to some MDF or other material, and just make these templates by hand, and then use your router just like I'm doing here to cut out the opening. I thought of a handful of different ways to make a hinge work for this flip-up lid, and these little hinges that I found on Amazon ended up being the best solution that I could find. They're pretty low profile, inexpensive, and they were easy to install. So you're gonna have to forgive me, this is the only clip of making the lid for this desk that I actually recorded. Sorry about that.
So I ended up having to make a second desktop because that seam that I thought I was going to be able to hide, it just didn't happen. It wasn't going to look good enough. The only thing left to do is to fill some of these wormholes, touch up the epoxy, and then I'm ready for sanding and finish.
My go-to sprayed finish is always either General Finishes High Performance Top Coat or Enduro Poly because they're both low VOC and I'm not worried about spraying them in the basement. Once I've laid down 2 to 3 coats of finish to the desktop and the lid, I go ahead and install the hinge. For doors and drawer fronts, I opt to hang them and spray all the sides at once as opposed to just spraying one surface, waiting for it to dry, and then flipping it over. Now, since this is a painted piece, the first thing I'm going to do is apply 2 coats of General Finishes stain blocking primer. I wait a couple hours between each coat, and then I wait 24 hours for the primer to cure as much as possible, and that really helps to lock in any potential tannins from bleeding through into the top coat, and this is especially important if your top coat is a light color. Now before I spray the top coat, which here I'm using Enduro White Poly, I sand everything lightly with a 220 grit sanding pad. This knocks off any dust burrs and nibs, and then I wipe everything down with a tack cloth. That way my finish will lay down nice and smooth and it'll be silky to the touch. To mark my drilling locations for the drawer pulls I'm using, I lay down some blue painter's tape, so that way I'm not marking on the freshly painted surface, and then I use a black felt tip marker. You can use a pencil if you'd like, but in certain lighting conditions, that can be pretty difficult to see. Because I added spacers to the front and back of this cabinet, it makes installing the drawer slides very easy. All I have to do is push them the right distance away from the front, and then pre-drill and screw them in place. Also, I only need to end up using 2 screws since those spacers are there to support it. To attach the drawer front, I first need to put the box in place, and then I grab a stack of playing cards and I even it out so that the drawer front sits in the opening evenly. A little bit of double-faced tape will hold the drawer front in place temporarily, and then I scooch it out just a little bit and throw a clamp on either side to hold it in place. I then remove the drawer box from the cabinet and set it on the bench to install some 1-inch screws. From here, if any minor adjustments need to be made, I can use the jack screws on the drawer slides to make the fit perfect. So this little guy right here is a support for the power strip, and I just need to mark locations for the mounting holes, and then I use 2 3/4 inch pan head Craig screws to hold that power strip in place. This particular desk is easiest to do the final assembly on where you're wanting the desk to be set up. So everybody comes over to lend a hand to knock out the final assembly.
You want to put the last one in?
With you? Yes! Right.
All right, nice job. If you want to make a desk like this one, make sure to grab those free plans that are linked below. If you have any comments or questions, I'd love to chat. Until next time, let the sawdust fly and have fun making something.